Every year, one of the biggest things we do is the Defense News Top 100, laying out the biggest companies in terms of revenue in the defense sphere. This year definitely had some surprises and some new companies hitting the top 10. To learn more, I chatted with Deputy Editor Aaron Mehta to get his take on the rankings. Aaron, thanks for sitting down with me here to talk about Top 100. First of all, congrats on going through all this data, and you and the rest of our team for going through that. It can't necessarily have been easy, I bet.
Yeah, it's a giant lift for the entire team, so we're all happy it's done, but it's kind of the marquee product for Defense News. We've been doing it for decades now. It wouldn't be a summer without a good chunk of it being spent crunching all these numbers and getting it done.
Normally I'd say you'd be pulling your hair out, but I don't think there's enough on the top of your head right now to pull out, so I'm glad you guys made it through okay. So looking at this year's Top 100, what were your main takeaways?
Yeah, so look, Lockheed Martin is the biggest defense company in the world. They've been the biggest defense company in the world for many years. Chances are they're going to stay the biggest defense company in the world. They were almost $20 billion more in defense revenue than the next closest company, Boeing. Boeing is number 2 in the world. Last year they actually weren't number 2, but it was because of a reporting issue that they had. They've changed how they did the reporting for 1 year. They switched it back. All of a sudden they're back to number 2. A lot of the big companies you expect to see, your Raytheon, your General Dynamics, your Northrop Grumman, they're in the top 10. They've been in the top 10 for a long time. The defense industry is a very top-heavy industry. It's essentially a bell curve. You're going to have your biggest companies up top, then kind of a narrow middle, and that middle is shrinking. We can talk about that later. And then kind of the lower tier companies, which are more second tier, or you got national champions for smaller countries. That's just kind of the shape of things now. It's probably going to stay that shape for a while.
So you don't necessarily see why it's not like a normal, it's not like a college football ranking or something like that where everyone jumps around all the time.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of stability. Now there are some things that change, and kind of the biggest driver is mergers and acquisitions domestically, and some international stuff that we'll get into shortly. So there are changes. Things have changed, and I would say this year is probably the biggest change in the 6 years that I've been doing this stuff. But essentially, again, you have your big companies, and they're pretty stable.
And so talk to me about that middle. What's your takeaway from that middle tier of companies?
Yeah, so the companies that do kind of support those things like sensors, things like services, MRO type stuff.
Not necessarily platforms, more the sustainment and...
Right, or pieces of platforms. And some smaller platforms, things like drones, things like that. That market is actually shrinking a little bit. And we've seen this the last couple of years. There's been merger and acquisition activity done. The big companies have gobbled up smaller companies to add to their portfolios. Some of the smaller companies have merged to kind of stay ahead. We expect that trend to be one that continues for quite a bit, at least for a couple of years, because frankly, there's only so many companies left in that market, and they're going to start to run out of people they can possibly merge with internally. And then again, you get to kind of the lower section, and it opens up again, because there are certain companies that are what we call national champions. Countries want to have a defense industry. Usually if they're a smaller country, they can only have 1 or 2 companies, but the country will essentially make sure those companies stay open. So they're going to be there no matter what.
Example of that, like SAMI in Saudi Arabia and others.
Exactly, that's a good one. That's one of the smaller ones new coming up. Maybe a better example would be some of the Japanese companies that we've seen. In Italy, there's a couple of smaller companies. The UK is one of the big countries where you actually can have many companies, although we'll see with Brexit going forward if that starts to change as well.
We have Chinese data for the first time in the Defense News 100. How did that come about, and what did we learn?
Yeah, so China has been the black hole in our data for years, right? We know that they have the second biggest defense budget in the world, but we don't know necessarily who's benefiting from that internally there. What we did was we partnered with a London-based think tank, IASS. They have an amazing group of researchers there. Who have for the last couple of years been trying to crack this nut and figure out kind of how do we tell who the big defense industry players are in China. They've kind of been refining their methodology, and this year we talked to them, they explained it to us, and we felt comfortable enough that they know what they're doing, these numbers seem to line up. They actually had a really good test case where while they were drawing mostly from public numbers and kind of open source reporting, they found one case where there was numbers they could actually kind of prove their theories against, and they matched up really well with one of the big companies. So what do they find? After pouring through a couple hundred companies to narrow it down to the 8 parent companies, there are 8 companies in the top 100. There are 8 companies in the top 25. China is massive. We knew they were massive, but this is the first time we've really been able to see that. AVIC is number 5. That's their big aviation company. That's the top one in the top 10. They have a lot of companies in the top 15. It's going to grow because their 6th and 8th largest defense companies, which are shipbuilding companies, are expected to merge in the next year. So just like there's M&A activity for growth elsewhere, we're going to see that in China. That's going to pop them up into the top 10.
And then the Chinese also are pumping a lot of money into shipbuilding themselves. So I mean, that's huge. So is this, and do you think that's emblematic of the Chinese military pumping money into their military?
Yeah, so it's tied directly into the Chinese defense budgets. Largely Chinese defense companies, while there have been some sales abroad, notably to Pakistan and Myanmar and a couple of smaller countries, most of their funding is internal. It's the Chinese military buying Chinese weapons. Some of that's been new development, some of it's knockoff development. We've seen with their fighters, very clear knockoff from the F-35. We know that was hacked in the past. But they're also now starting to invest in the areas where they've been weakest. They were weakest in aircraft engines and ship propulsions. They're purposely setting up groups to just focus on that and learn how to develop that. So there's no reason to think they won't continue to develop and grow in the future. The big question has been, and I think is still somewhat open-ended, is how much of a player they're going to become in the international market. I really don't see, and the IISS researchers don't see this becoming a massive challenge to Western defense industry because of the nature of the political split and who you buy from. Russian companies might need to watch out because there's a similar crossover of the countries that could be sold to. And China, a lot of those companies that have bought from Russia in the past, it's because they get cheap stuff that works. China can make their stuff cheaper and make it work better. All of a sudden, Russian companies might find themselves out in the cold.
So before we pivot to Russia, because I do have an overall question there, but looking at this, do you see like in the United States where we see massive years of growth in the defense budget followed by contraction or not as much money being pumped in, do you see China kind of on a solid rise right now over the next several years?
Yeah, there's no reason to think it's going to slow down. Everything that we've seen from China, including US DIA estimates, intelligence estimates, say that they're going to continue to pump money into their defense budget. As long as they keep doing that, they're going to be buying new stuff. These companies are going to keep growing.
And so looking at Russia, though, what did we learn from Russia this year, from the various Russian companies and everything like that?
Yeah, unfortunately this year, a lot of the Russian companies decided not to participate. We've, in the past, reached out to them and been able to get some information. The other thing that happened was a matter of timing. The Russian companies tend to report out some of their earnings, or at least their revenues, as they see them, kind of in the later part of the summer. Last year, our top 100 was later, and we were able to actually draw from some of those open source documents and use those. We weren't able to do that necessarily this time. As a result, there's only 2 Russian companies on the list. There would be more, but again, we just don't have that information. What have we seen from them? They're still doing okay. They're still, doing fine, but again, there's not a sense of growth there. The Russian military spending is expected to start to draw down in the next couple of years, just as a financial reality. That'll hurt them. And again, if China rises and becomes a greater weapons exporter, the reality is they could really just take some of these Russian companies out abroad and take some of their work share, and that's not going to help.
All right, so looking ahead to the U.S., so all this, it's important to note that all this top 100 data is based on 2018 data.
Yes.
But in 2019, we've had some pretty big things that have happened. The L3 Harris merger has been closed this year. Right. You have Raytheon and UTC merging, or UTC, whatever you want to call it. That's going to open up some massive playing. What do you see both the mergers impacting and for general impacts for next year's top 100 based on what we've seen in 19?
Yeah, so the Raytheon Technologies merger, UTC and Raytheon, that's going to be massive. That's going to put them probably number 3 on the list, maybe number 2, based on this year's numbers. There's a question of what happens with L3 Raytheon, where they end up in terms of actual defense revenues, because there's going to be some reshuffling that goes on there. Some things get maybe sold off, but they're expected to be big. That fits into the whole question of what we're talking about with that kind of shrinking middle. None of these were small companies, don't get me wrong, but these guys are just kind of finding the few niches that are left, buying up the middle tier companies. Those companies are going to really struggle to compete now. If you're make a widget or make a sensor or something, how are you going to compete against the L3 Raytheon combination?
Those two are going to hold a duopoly on.
Right, and so what's going to happen to those small companies? Either they're going to have to try to find similar sized companies to merge, or they're going to get bought by a bigger company. If you're Lockheed Martin, do you look at something that maybe can keep you in that market, buy that group up, add to your giant share already? So I think there's going to be fall off from this, not just in terms of, again, 2 large companies have now become even bigger companies. But in terms of kind of the follow-on effects, I think we're really going to see that in the next couple of years. The other thing, obviously, is the defense budget. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with that. There seem to be some positive signs that a deal is going to be worked out that will give stability. If that happens, I think we're going to see defense continue to be strong for at least a couple of years. All
right, Aaron, thanks for the time. I really appreciate it. Again, great work and for the rest of the team for getting all this compiled. This is awesome.
Thanks, Jeff.